You're standing in an elegant ballroom, wearing your dream dress, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and the soft murmur of celebration. Your engagement ring catches the light as you reach for a glass of champagne, your heart full of joy and anticipation for the future. Then, from across the room, you hear words that stop you cold. "She's not good enough for our son." The smile freezes on your face. The champagne suddenly tastes bitter. And in that moment, everything changes. This is Sandra's story, a story about discovering your own worth when the world tries to tell you you're not enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sandra Martinez had always been a dreamer with dirt under her fingernails. At 24, she managed the community garden in Riverside, California, where she'd spent the last 3 years transforming abandoned lots into flourishing green spaces that fed families and brought neighborhoods together. Her small apartment was filled with seedlings on every windowsill, botanical sketches pinned to the walls, and the earthy scent of fresh herbs she dried herself. She wasn't wealthy, far from it. Her beat-up Honda Civic had seen better days, and she shopped at thrift stores not for the aesthetic, but out of necessity. But Sandra had something money couldn't buy: a radiant spirit and an infectious laugh that made strangers feel like old friends. She had a way of seeing beauty in broken things and potential in forgotten places. That's exactly what drew David Richardson to her. They'd met at a farmer's market on a sunny Saturday morning in March. Sandra was selling vegetables from the community garden, her curly black hair escaping from a messy bun, soil still visible under her short nails as she handed over bunches of vibrant carrots to customers. David had approached her booth, initially just looking for fresh basil, but found himself captivated by the passion in her voice as she explained how each plant was grown with love by different families in the neighborhood. These tomatoes were grown by Mrs. Chen, who's 83 and still outworks people half her age, Sandra had said, her brown eyes lighting up. And these peppers? They're from the Rodriguez family's plot. Their 12-year-old daughter Maria designed the entire layout herself. David Richardson was nothing like the men Sandra usually dated, if you could call her sporadic coffee dates and casual encounters dating. At 28, he was already a successful architect at his family's firm, Richardson and Associates, one of the most prestigious architecture companies in Southern California. He drove a pristine BMW, wore tailored suits that cost more than Sandra made in 2 months, and lived in a sleek downtown loft that could have graced the pages of Architectural Digest. But when David looked at Sandra that morning, he didn't see her worn jeans or calloused hands. He saw someone who built communities the same way he built structures, with vision, dedication, and care. They talked for 2 hours after the market closed, sitting on a bench under a jacaranda tree, sharing stories about creation and growth. Their relationship bloomed like Sandra's gardens, slowly, naturally, and with deep roots. David would pick her up after work, still in his expensive suits, and help her water plants and harvest vegetables. Sandra would sketch architectural details she noticed around the city, surprising David with her natural eye for design and structure. They balanced each other perfectly, his precision and her intuition, his resources and her resourcefulness, his refined world and her authentic one. 8 months later, David proposed on the rooftop of Sandra's apartment building, surrounded by the container garden she'd created there. The ring was simple but beautiful, a vintage setting he'd found at an estate sale, because Sandra had once mentioned she loved things with history and stories. As the sun set over the Los Angeles skyline, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, Sandra said yes with tears streaming down her cheeks.
She knew David's family was wealthy. She'd heard stories about the Richardson family legacy, how David's great-grandfather had started the firm in 1952, how they'd designed some of the most iconic buildings in California, how the family name carried weight in elite social circles. But David had always been just David to her. The man who learned the names of every plant in her garden, who brought her coffee on early mornings, who listened to her dreams of expanding urban agriculture programs across the city. The engagement party was planned for a Saturday evening in November at the Meridian Country Club in Newport Beach, a venue Sandra had only seen in magazines. David's mother, Patricia Richardson, had insisted on handling all the arrangements. "It's tradition in our family," she said, when Sandra offered to help, her smile polite but distant. "We want everything to be perfect for David." Sandra had tried not to feel dismissed. She told herself Patricia was just being generous, wanting to take the burden off the bride-to-be. But there had been something in the older woman's tone, a subtle emphasis on "for David," that made Sandra's stomach flutter with unease. The week before the party, Sandra had driven to 3 different shopping centers trying to find a dress that would fit both the formal occasion and her modest budget. She finally found a beautiful navy blue dress at a consignment shop. Elegant and classic, with delicate lace details that made her feel confident and lovely. She paired it with simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother and low heels she could actually walk in.
David picked her up that evening, looking devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. "You look absolutely stunning," he said, spinning her around in her tiny living room. "My family is going to love you." The drive to Newport Beach took 45 minutes, and with each mile, Sandra felt the knot in her stomach tighten. David chatted excitedly about wanting to introduce her to his cousins, about how proud he was to call her his fiancée, about the future they'd build together. His enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time they pulled into the country club's circular driveway, Sandra felt her confidence returning. The Meridian Country Club was even more impressive in person than in photos. Towering white columns framed the entrance, and perfectly manicured gardens stretched in every direction. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms rushed to open car doors, and guests in designer gowns and expensive suits streamed through the ornate entrance. Inside, the ballroom took Sandra's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across cream-colored walls adorned with oil paintings, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of the Pacific Ocean. Round tables draped in ivory linens were set with gold-rimmed china and centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while servers in black and white uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "David!" A tall, elegant woman in a champagne-colored gown glided toward them, her arms outstretched. Patricia Richardson was 62, but looked 50, her silver hair styled in a sophisticated chignon and her neck adorned with what Sandra was pretty sure were real diamonds. "Mom, you outdid yourself," David said, embracing his mother warmly. "Everything looks incredible." Patricia's smile was radiant as she looked at her son, but when her pale blue eyes shifted to Sandra, something cooled. "Sandra," she said, her voice perfectly polite, "how lovely to see you again. That's a charming dress." Sandra felt heat creep up her neck. She knew that tone. The way women could make a compliment sound like criticism with just the right inflection. "Thank you, Mrs. Richardson. The party is absolutely beautiful. You've created such an elegant atmosphere." "Well, we wanted something worthy of the Richardson name," Patricia replied, already turning her attention back to David. "Come, there are so many people who want to congratulate you." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. David's extended family was large and prosperous, uncles who owned tech companies, aunts married to judges and politicians, cousins who were doctors and lawyers and investment bankers. They were polite to Sandra, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated and found wanting. She overheard snippets of conversations that made her cheeks burn, whispered discussions about David's surprising choice, and speculation about what he saw in her. When David's aunts asked what she did for work and Sandra explained about the community garden, the woman's eyebrows had risen so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline.
"How community-minded of you," the aunt had said, the same way someone might comment on a peculiar hobby. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, introducing Sandra with genuine pride and enthusiasm. He talked about her work with such admiration that Sandra began to relax, remembering why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He wasn't like his family. He saw value in what she did, in who she was. The evening was nearly over when Sandra excused herself to use the restroom. The ladies' lounge was as opulent as the rest of the venue, with marble countertops, gold fixtures, and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. As she touched up her lipstick, Sandra could hear voices from the adjoining sitting area. "I just don't understand what David is thinking," a woman was saying, a voice Sandra recognized as belonging to David's Aunt Margaret. "She's sweet enough, I suppose, but she's so ordinary." "More than ordinary," came another voice, one that made Sandra's blood run cold. It was Patricia Richardson. "She's completely wrong for him. Different background, different values, different everything. She's not good enough for our son." Sandra's hand froze halfway to her lips, the lipstick tube trembling in her grip. "Have you tried talking to David about it?" Margaret asked. "Of course I have. But you know how stubborn he can be when he gets an idea in his head. He thinks he's in love." Patricia's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Hopefully, he'll come to his senses before it's too late. A Richardson can't marry just anyone. There are expectations, responsibilities, standards." Sandra's reflection stared back at her from the mirror, her own face suddenly looking as inadequate as she felt. The dress that had made her feel confident now seemed cheap and ill-fitting. The pearl earrings looked fake under the bright lights. Everything about her felt wrong, out of place, not good enough. She waited in the stall until the voices faded, then emerged on unsteady legs. In the mirror, she practiced her smile, the same bright, genuine smile that had charmed David at the farmer's market, but now it felt like a mask, fragile and false. When she returned to the ballroom, the party was winding down. David was deep in conversation with his father and several other men, their voices animated as they discussed business. Sandra stood at the edge of their circle, invisible and forgotten, as Patricia's words echoed in her mind. "She's not good enough for our son." The drive home was quiet. David was tired and content, humming along to the radio and occasionally reaching over to squeeze Sandra's hand. He didn't notice her silence, didn't see the way she stared out the window at the passing lights, her mind racing. "That went perfectly," David said as they pulled up to her apartment building. "Everyone loved you. I'm so proud to have you as my fiancé." Sandra managed a smile and murmured agreement, but inside, something had shifted. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of traffic, Patricia Richardson's words played on repeat in her mind. Not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. For the first time since David had slipped that ring onto her finger, Sandra wondered if maybe his mother was right.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The Monday morning after the engagement party arrived gray and drizzling, matching Sandra's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept, Patricia Richardson's words echoing in her mind like a broken record. As she unlocked the gates to Riverside Community Garden, the familiar scent of wet earth and growing things usually brought her peace. Today, it felt like a reminder of everything that separated her from David's world.
Sandra threw herself into work with unusual intensity, yanking weeds with more force than necessary and muttering under her breath. Mrs. Chen, the 83-year-old grandmother who tended the largest vegetable plot, watched with concern as Sandra aggressively pruned the tomato plants. "Mija, those poor plants didn't do anything to hurt you," Mrs. Chen said gently, her weathered hands stilling Sandra's movements. "What's troubling your heart?" Sandra's composure cracked. The whole story poured out. The engagement party, the overheard conversation, Patricia's cutting assessment of her worth. Mrs. Chen listened without judgment, occasionally clicking her tongue in sympathy. "Hi, Sandra," Mrs. Chen sighed when the story ended. "Rich people, they think money makes them better than everyone else. But I've seen your heart. You make miracles grow from nothing. That woman, she doesn't know what real value looks like." Before Sandra could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Coffee after work? Can't stop thinking about how perfect last night was. Love you." The disconnect between his perception and her reality made Sandra's stomach churn. How could she tell him what she'd heard? How could she destroy his happiness with the truth about his family's opinion of her? That evening, they met at their usual coffee shop, a cozy place called The Grind, that served fair trade coffee in mismatched mugs. David was practically glowing as he recounted conversations from the party, completely oblivious to the undercurrents Sandra had witnessed. "Uncle Robert wants to discuss some urban development projects with you," David said excitedly. "He's impressed with your work with community spaces. And Mom mentioned she'd love to have lunch with you soon to discuss wedding plans." Sandra nearly choked on her latte. Patricia Richardson wanting to discuss wedding plans was like a fox offering to guard the henhouse. "That's nice of her," she managed. "I told you she'd come around," David said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "She just needed time to get to know you better. Once she sees what I see in you, she'll love you as much as I do." The innocent faith in his voice broke Sandra's heart. He genuinely believed his family had embraced her, that love was enough to bridge any divide. She wanted desperately to believe it too, but Patricia's words had shattered that illusion. Over the following weeks, Sandra tried to pretend everything was normal, but the doubt had taken root and was growing like kudzu, choking out her confidence. She found herself second-guessing everything, her clothes, her words, her dreams. When David suggested they start looking at venues for their wedding, Sandra felt panic rather than excitement. The breaking point came 3 weeks later when Patricia Richardson called Sandra directly. "Sandra, dear, I was wondering if you'd join me for lunch this Saturday. There are some things I'd like to discuss about the wedding preparations." Sandra's hands went clammy. "Of course, Mrs. Richardson, I'd be happy to." "Wonderful. Let's meet at the Balboa Bay Club at noon. And Sandra, do try to dress appropriately for the venue." The line went dead, leaving Sandra staring at her phone. Even Patricia's invitations came with barbs. Saturday arrived with typical Southern California sunshine, mocking Sandra's inner turmoil. She'd spent an hour agonizing over her outfit, finally settling on a simple black dress and blazer she'd splurged on for job interviews. As she drove toward Newport Beach, her palms grew slick with sweat. The Balboa Bay Club was even more intimidating than the country club had been. Sleek and modern, it screamed exclusivity from its gated entrance to its pristine marina, filled with yachts that cost more than most people's houses. Sandra felt like an imposter as she walked through the marble-floored lobby, her heels clicking nervously on the polished surface. Patricia was already seated at a waterfront table when Sandra arrived, looking perfectly composed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sandra's monthly rent. She air-kissed Sandra's cheeks with the precision of someone who'd mastered the art of appearing warm while remaining utterly cold. "You look lovely, dear," Patricia said, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "Shall we order? I recommend the salmon. It's flown in fresh from Alaska." They made small talk through the appetizer course, Patricia sharing anecdotes about other Richardson family weddings with surgical precision. Each story seemed designed to emphasize the family's social standing, their connections, their expectations for a daughter-in-law who could represent the Richardson name appropriately. You know, Patricia said as their main courses arrived, David has always been our most idealistic child. Even as a boy, he had such romantic notions about love conquering all. It's rather endearing, really, though not always practical. Sandra's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Oh, I think you do, Patricia replied, delicately cutting her salmon. You seem like an intelligent young woman. Surely you've realized that this infatuation of David's puts both of you in an impossible position. The word infatuation hit Sandra like a slap. David and I love each other, Mrs. Richardson. Our relationship isn't some passing fancy. Love, how wonderfully naive. Sandra, dear, let me be frank with you. David is the heir to a multi-generational legacy. He'll inherit not only money, but responsibilities, social obligations, expectations from clients, colleagues, and community leaders who expect the Richardson name to represent certain standards. Sandra felt heat floating her cheeks. Are you saying I don't meet those standards? I'm saying that love, while lovely in theory, isn't enough to bridge the vast differences between your worlds. Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You work with your hands in dirt, Sandra. You shop at thrift stores. You drive a car that's older than some of our interns. Do you honestly believe you can represent the Richardson family at charity galas and business functions?
Each word was a precisely aimed arrow, hitting Sandra's deepest insecurities. But it was Patricia's next statement that delivered the killing blow. I've done some research on your background, Patricia continued smoothly. Your father left when you were 7. Your mother cleaned houses to support you. You qualified for free lunch programs throughout school. There's nothing wrong with humble beginnings, of course, but they do leave marks. Sandra's vision went white around the edges. Patricia had investigated her past, reduced her family's struggles to weapons to be used against her. The shame and anger warring in her chest made it hard to breathe. I can see you're upset, Patricia said, her tone falsely sympathetic. But I'm trying to save both of you from a painful mistake. David deserves someone who can enhance his life, not limit it. And you deserve someone from your own world, someone who won't make you feel constantly inadequate. You don't know anything about what I deserve, Sandra whispered, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Don't I? Tell me, Sandra, when you're at our family gatherings, do you feel confident and comfortable, or do you feel like you're playing a role you're not equipped for? When David's colleagues discuss business deals worth millions, can you contribute meaningfully to those conversations? When charity boards need leadership, can you write the checks that make a real difference? Every question was another nail in the coffin of Sandra's self-worth, because the terrible truth was that Patricia wasn't entirely wrong. Sandra had felt out of place at the engagement party, had struggled to connect with David's family, had wondered if she was holding him back from the life he deserved. I'm not trying to be cruel, Patricia continued, misreading Sandra's silence as surrender. I'm being practical. David could have any woman he wants, women with the right education, the right connections, the right background to be true partners in his future. Why would you want to deny him that? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Patricia signaled for the check with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won. Think about what's best for David. If you truly love him, you'll want what's best for his future. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step aside. Sandra sat frozen at the table long after Patricia left, staring at the untouched salmon on her plate. Around her, other diners chatted and laughed, living their lives while hers felt like it was crumbling. The waiter eventually approached tentatively, asking if everything was all right. I'm sorry, Sandra mumbled, fumbling for her wallet. I need to go. She drove home in a daze, Patricia's words echoing in her mind. By the time she reached her apartment, she'd made a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating.
She needed to talk to someone who would help her see clearly, someone who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. That someone was her best friend and former college roommate, Maya Gonzalez, who worked as a social worker in downtown Los Angeles. Maya had been Sandra's voice of reason through every major life decision, never afraid to tell her hard truths when necessary. Sandra called Maya as soon as she got home, and within an hour, Maya was at her door with a bottle of wine and a grim expression. "Tell me everything," Maya said, settling onto Sandra's second-hand couch. Sandra poured out the entire story, from the overheard conversation at the engagement party to Patricia's calculated assault at lunch. Maya listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing harder with each detail. "That woman is a piece of work," Maya said when Sandra finished. "But Sandra, you can't let her win. You can't let her convince you that you're not worthy of love and happiness." "But what if she's right?" Sandra whispered. "What if I'm holding David back? What if he deserves someone better?" Maya grabbed Sandra's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. "Listen to me very carefully. Your worth isn't determined by your bank account or your family's history or whether you can discuss yacht specifications at cocktail parties. You're brilliant, compassionate, and you've built something beautiful from nothing with those community gardens. You've made more positive impact on people's lives than Patricia Richardson ever has with all her charity galas." "But David's future? David's future is his choice to make, not his mother's, not yours based on her poisonous words. His. The question is, what do you want your future to look like?" That question would haunt Sandra for the rest of the week. As she tended her gardens and went through the motions of her daily life, she couldn't stop thinking about paths and choices and the weight of other people's expectations. The crisis came to a head the following Friday when David called, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Sandra, you'll never guess what happened. Dad offered me a partnership in the firm with a specialty in sustainable urban development. He wants me to spearhead projects that combine luxury with environmental consciousness. It's everything I've dreamed of, and he says it was partly inspired by seeing how passionate I am about your work." Sandra should have felt joy for him, pride in his success. Instead, she felt trapped. This opportunity was everything David had worked for, but it also meant deeper integration into the Richardson family business, more scrutiny, higher stakes. "That's wonderful, David," I managed. "I'm proud of you. The best part is that he wants to discuss bringing you in as a consultant for the environmental aspects. Can you imagine? We could work together to create developments that actually help communities instead of displacing them." The irony was crushing. David's family was offering her a role in their world, but only after his mother had made it clear that she would never truly belong in it. She would always be the outsider, the charity case, the woman who wasn't quite good enough but might be useful for her expertise. That night, Sandra stood on her building's rooftop, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the choice before her. She could marry David and spend her life feeling inadequate, constantly trying to prove herself to people who had already decided she wasn't worthy, or she could walk away and spare them both that pain. For the first time since the engagement party, Sandra began to seriously consider that maybe Patricia Richardson was right about one thing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step aside. But as she stood there in the darkness, another voice began to whisper in my mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Mrs. Chen. That woman doesn't know what real value looks like. The question was, did Sandra?
Sandra woke up Monday morning with a decision crystallizing in her mind like frost on a window. She wouldn't let Patricia Richardson's words define her worth, but she also wouldn't ignore the very real challenges ahead. If she was going to marry into the Richardson family, she needed to level the playing field, not by changing who she was, but by becoming the best version of herself. The first step was education. Not because Patricia was right about her inadequacies, but because Sandra realized she wanted to expand her impact beyond the community garden. David's partnership offer had planted a seed. What if she could bridge the gap between grassroots environmental work and large-scale development? What if she could speak their language while never forgetting her own? That morning, instead of going straight to the garden, Sandra drove to the UCLA Extension campus in Westwood. She'd researched their Sustainable Urban Planning Certificate program online over the weekend, staying up until 3 a.m. reading course descriptions and faculty bios. The program would take 18 months to complete while working full-time, but it would give her the credentials and vocabulary to stand toe-to-toe with anyone in David's world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the program director, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen it all. Her office walls were covered with photos from development projects around the world: urban farms in Detroit, greenhousing in Singapore, water reclamation systems in Sao Paulo. "Tell me why you want to be here," Dr. Vasquez said after Sandra had outlined her background and goals. "Because I know what works at the ground level," Sandra replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I've seen how green spaces can transform communities, how growing your own food can give people dignity and hope. But I also know that small-scale solutions aren't enough. If we want real change, we need to influence the people making decisions about entire neighborhoods, entire cities." Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair, studying Sandra intently. The Richardson family firm is well known in urban development circles. Prestigious, but traditional. If you're planning to work with them, you'll face resistance from people who see environmental concerns as obstacles to profit. "Then I'll have to prove them wrong," Sandra said simply. A slow smile spread across Dr. Vasquez's face. "I like your attitude. But I should warn you, this program is rigorous. You'll be studying alongside architects, city planners, and policy analysts. Many of them have advanced degrees and years of experience. Are you prepared for that challenge?" Sandra thought about Patricia's cutting words, about feeling lost among David's educated, polished family members. "I've been underestimated before. It just motivates me to work harder." Dr. Vasquez nodded approvingly. "Classes start next month. I'll make sure you get into the program, but the rest is up to you." Walking across the UCLA campus afterward, Sandra felt something she hadn't experienced since the engagement party. Hope. Not the naive hope that love would conquer all, but the determined hope that came from taking action. Her next stop was the downtown library, where she checked out every book she could find on sustainable development, urban planning, and environmental policy. If she was going to succeed in this program, she needed to hit the ground running. That evening, she spread the books across her small kitchen table and began to read. Meanwhile, her relationship with David entered a strange new phase. He was thrilled about his partnership opportunity and couldn't stop talking about the projects they might work together on. Sandra found herself asking more technical questions, pushing him to explain concepts she was encountering in her reading. David seemed delighted by her increased interest in his work, completely unaware of the deeper motivation behind it. "You're really getting into this stuff," he said one evening as they walked through downtown Los Angeles, Sandra pointing out various architectural features she'd learned to identify. "Have you thought about maybe taking some classes? You have such a natural instinct for spatial relationships." Sandra smiled, not ready to reveal her plans yet. "Maybe I will." 2 weeks later, she had her first real test. David invited her to a cocktail reception for the Los Angeles Urban Development Council, an organization his father had belonged to for decades. It was exactly the kind of event that would have terrified her a month ago. A room full of architects, city planners, real estate developers, and politicians discussing million-dollar projects and policy changes. This time, Sandra prepared like she was studying for the most important exam of her life. She researched every major development project currently underway in Los Angeles, memorized the names and backgrounds of key players in the industry, and practiced talking about her community garden work in terms that would resonate with this audience. The reception was held at the Millennium Biltmore Hotel downtown, another intimidatingly elegant venue filled with people in expensive suits discussing deals that would reshape neighborhoods.
Sandra wore a new dress, still affordable, but carefully chosen to project competence and confidence. She'd spent an hour watching YouTube videos on networking etiquette and professional conversation skills. "Sandra, there's someone I want you to meet," David said, guiding her towards a distinguished black man in his 60s. "This is Marcus Williams. He's heading up the Boyle Heights Revitalization Project." Sandra's pulse quickened. She'd read about this project extensively, a controversial development that promised to bring new housing and commercial space to the historically Latino neighborhood, but faced criticism for potentially displacing longtime residents. "Mr. Williams," Sandra said, extending her hand confidently. "I've been following your project with great interest. The community integration components are fascinating, especially the plan to incorporate existing local businesses into the new commercial spaces." Marcus Williams raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such specific knowledge from someone he'd never met. "You're familiar with the project details?" "I work in community development," Sandra replied smoothly. "I manage the Riverside Community Garden, and I've seen firsthand how green spaces can transform communities, how growing your own food can give people dignity and hope. But I also know that small-scale solutions aren't enough. If we want real change, we need to influence the people making decisions about entire neighborhoods, entire cities." What followed was a 20-minute conversation about sustainable development, community engagement, and environmental justice that left Sandra feeling exhilarated. Williams was impressed enough to give her his business card and suggest they continue the discussion over coffee. "You never mentioned you were interested in urban planning," Williams said to David as Sandra excused herself to get a drink. "She's full of surprises," David replied, beaming with pride. "She has this incredible way of seeing how environmental and social issues connect."
As Sandra made her way to the bar, she overheard a familiar voice and froze. Patricia Richardson was standing near the windows with two other well-dressed women, their conversation clearly audible over the cocktail party chatter. "David seems quite taken with that gardener girl," one of the women was saying. "I'm surprised she's here tonight." "Oh, we're trying to include her in family activities," Patricia replied with false sweetness. "Poor thing is trying so hard to fit in. It's rather touching, really, watching her attempt to understand conversations about real estate values and development finance." Sandra felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time it was accompanied by something else: determination. Patricia expected her to fail, to prove that she didn't belong. Instead, Sandra was going to prove exactly the opposite. She spent the rest of the evening working the room like a professional, engaging in substantive conversations about sustainable development with some of the most influential people in Los Angeles real estate. By the time the reception ended, she'd collected a dozen business cards and received 3 invitations to follow-up meetings. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately," David said as they drove home, "but I love seeing you so engaged with this world. You were incredible tonight. Marcus Williams was practically recruiting you to join his team." Sandra smiled, feeling more confident than she had in weeks. "I've been doing some research, thinking about how I might contribute more meaningfully to urban development conversations." "That's amazing," David said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I knew my family would see how special you are once they got to know you better." Sandra didn't have the heart to tell him that his mother's opinion remained unchanged. Patricia had watched Sandra's performance that evening with the cold calculation of a chess player studying an opponent's unexpected move. There had been no approval in her gaze, only recalibration. The next challenge came sooner than expected. 3 days after the reception, Patricia called with another lunch invitation. This time her tone was different, less condescending, more strategic. "I must say, Sandra, you made quite an impression at the LUDC reception. Marcus Williams spoke very highly of your conversation." "I enjoyed meeting him. His project raises important questions about balancing development with community preservation." Sandra's smile was razor-sharp. "Yes, you seem to have developed quite an interest in urban planning. David mentioned you're considering taking some classes."
Sandra's decision crystallized in that moment. She was tired of being defensive, tired of hiding her ambitions out of fear that Patricia would find new ways to diminish her. Instead, Sandra was going to prove exactly the opposite. Actually, I've already enrolled in UCLA's Sustainable Urban Planning Certificate program. Classes start next week. For the first time since Sandra had known her, Patricia Richardson looked genuinely surprised. It was a small victory, but Sandra savored it. "How ambitious of you," she said slowly. "Of course, such programs can be quite challenging for someone without the proper academic background." "I'm sure they can be," Sandra agreed pleasantly. "Fortunately, I've always been a quick learner." The rest of the lunch passed in thinly veiled verbal sparring, with Patricia probing for weaknesses and Sandra deflecting with newfound confidence. When they parted ways, Sandra could see the calculation in Patricia's eyes. The dismissive contempt had been replaced with something more dangerous, recognition that Sandra might actually pose a threat to her plans. That evening, Sandra sat in her apartment surrounded by textbooks and course materials, preparing for her first day of classes. Maya stopped by with Chinese takeout and moral support. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," she said, surveying the academic fortress Sandra had built around herself. "This is either the best decision you've ever made, or you're setting yourself up for a spectacular breakdown." "Probably both," Sandra admitted. "But Maya, I realized something important. I was letting Patricia define the terms of this battle. She made me feel like I had to choose between being true to myself and being worthy of David. But that's a false choice. I can honor where I come from while still growing into something bigger." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "Just promise me you're doing this for you, not just to prove something to David's snobbish mother." Sandra considered the question seriously. "I'm doing it for both," she said finally. "I want to prove to Patricia that she was wrong about me, but more importantly, I want to prove to myself that I can be everything I'm capable of being." The first day of classes arrived with typical Los Angeles sunshine, and Sandra's stomach tied in knots. The UCLA Extension classroom was filled with exactly the kind of people she'd expected. Polished professionals with impressive resumes and expensive laptops. As Dr. Vasquez introduced the curriculum and expectations, Sandra felt the familiar flutter of imposter syndrome. But when the discussion turned to community engagement in urban planning, Sandra found her voice. Her experiences with the Riverside Community Garden gave her insights that complemented the theoretical knowledge of her classmates. She spoke about the importance of involving existing residents in development decisions, about how green spaces could serve as bridges between old and new communities. Her classmates listened with genuine interest, and several approached her after class to continue the conversation. For the first time in weeks, Sandra felt like she belonged somewhere, not because she was trying to fit in, but because she had something valuable to contribute. As she walked to her car after that first class, Sandra's phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did your first day go? So proud of you for taking this step." She smiled as she typed back, "Better than I expected. I think I'm going to love this." What Sandra didn't know was that Patricia Richardson had already begun making phone calls, using her considerable influence to ensure that Sandra's journey towards legitimacy would be far more challenging than she imagined. The battle lines had been drawn, and Patricia had no intention of losing without a fight.
3 months into her certificate program, Sandra had found her rhythm. Her days began at 5 a.m. with coffee and reading assignments before heading to the community garden, followed by evening classes twice a week and weekend study sessions that stretched late into the night. She was exhausted but exhilarated, watching her understanding of urban systems expand like time-lapse footage of a growing plant. But Patricia Richardson's phone calls had been working behind the scenes like poison in the soil. The first sign of trouble came during Sandra's advanced environmental policy class,
Professor James Hartwell, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for intellectual rigor, had always been encouraging of Sandra's contributions. But that Tuesday evening, his demeanor shifted noticeably. "Ms. Martinez," he said after she'd presented her analysis of green infrastructure financing, "while your passion for community engagement is admirable, I wonder if you fully grasp the economic realities of large-scale development. Perhaps you might benefit from auditing some basic finance courses before tackling these more complex policy issues." The suggestion hung in the air like a slap. Sandra had spent weeks preparing that presentation, incorporating financial models she'd learned from her supplementary reading. Several classmates shot her sympathetic glances, clearly as surprised by Professor Hartwell's response as she was. After class, Sandra approached Dr. Vasquez, who had been observing from the back of the room. "Elena," Sandra said, using the first name Dr. Vasquez had invited her to use, "did I miss something in my presentation? Professor Hartwell seemed hostile." Dr. Vasquez finished, her expression grim. "Sandra, I need to tell you something. James mentioned that he'd received some concerns about your academic preparedness from industry contacts. He wouldn't say who, but given your background, I suspect we both know." Her stomach dropped. Patricia Richardson contacted him? "I can't prove it, but the timing is suspicious. James has never questioned a student's fundamental competence so publicly before." Dr. Vasquez leaned against her office doorframe, studying Sandra carefully. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That night, Sandra called Maya, her voice shaking with anger and frustration. "She's sabotaging my education now! She's using her connections to make professors doubt my abilities before I even have a chance to prove myself." "Can you file a complaint?" "Against whom? For what? No one's going to admit they were influenced by outside pressure, and even if they did, it would just confirm that I don't belong in that world." Maya was quiet for a moment. "So you're going to let her win?" "I'm going to prove her wrong," Sandra said, her voice hardening with determination. "If she wants to make this harder for me, fine. I'll work twice as hard as anyone else. I'll be so undeniably competent that her whisper campaigns become irrelevant." True to her word, Sandra threw herself into her studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She read every assigned text twice, completed optional assignments for extra credit, and scheduled office hours with every professor to demonstrate her commitment. When Professor Hartwell assigned a group project on sustainable transportation systems, Sandra volunteered to be the team leader and delivered a presentation so thorough and well-researched that even Hartwell had to grudgingly acknowledge its quality. But Patricia's influence extended beyond the classroom. 2 weeks later, Sandra received a call from Marcus Williams, the developer she'd impressed at the networking reception. "Sandra, I have some disappointing news. We've decided to go in a different direction for the community engagement consultant position. We felt we needed someone with more traditional credentials." Sandra's heart sank. She'd been looking forward to that opportunity as a chance to apply her learning in a real-world setting. "Can I ask what changed? When we spoke last month, you seemed enthusiastic about my community-based approach." There was a long pause. "Some concerns were raised about your experience level with large-scale projects. I'm sorry, Sandra, you're talented, but this particular project requires someone with a more established track record." After hanging up, Sandra sat in her car outside the UCLA campus, fighting back tears of frustration. She was certain Patricia's network had reached Marcus Williams, too. The woman was systematically closing doors before Sandra could even approach them. The situation escalated when David received a call from his father requesting a family dinner to discuss the partnership opportunity. Frank Richardson was a silver-haired man in his 70s who commanded respect through quiet authority rather than his wife's sharp manipulation. When they gathered at the Richardson family estate in Palos Verdes, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion overlooking the Pacific, Sandra could sense tension crackling beneath the polite conversation. "David, son," Frank said as they sat in his wood-paneled study after dinner, "I've been hearing some concerning reports about Sandra's educational pursuits." "What kind of reports?" David furrowed his brow. "Questions about her academic performance, her ability to handle complex policy work. Some colleagues in the industry have expressed doubts about whether she's ready for the kind of high-level consulting work we discussed." "That's ridiculous," David said, his voice rising with indignation. "Sandra is brilliant. She's bringing fresh perspectives to urban planning that these old guard developers have never considered." Patricia entered the study carrying a silver tea service, her timing impeccable. "Darling, no one's questioning Sandra's enthusiasm, but there's a difference between community gardening and urban development. The stakes are so much higher when you're dealing with multi-million-dollar projects and city planning departments." Sandra felt the familiar burn of being discussed as if she weren't present. "I'd like to speak for myself, if I may," she said firmly.
Frank nodded. "Of course." "I understand that my background is unconventional," Sandra began, choosing her words carefully. "But that's exactly why my perspective is valuable. Most urban planners have never lived in the communities they're designing for. They've never seen how development decisions impact families who've been in neighborhoods for generations. My experience gives me insights that traditional education can't provide." "Insights are one thing," Patricia interjected smoothly, "but clients expect expertise backed by credentials and track records. They're not paying for good intentions." "Which is why I'm pursuing formal education to complement my experience," Sandra replied. "I'm not trying to replace traditional knowledge. I'm trying to bridge the gap between academic theory and community reality." Frank studied her thoughtfully. "That's an admirable goal. But I have to consider what's best for the firm's reputation. Our clients trust us because we deliver results through proven methodologies." The conversation continued for another hour, with David defending Sandra's potential, while his parents raised subtle objections wrapped in concerns about risk management and client expectations. By the time they left, Sandra could see the doubt creeping into David's eyes, even as he continued to voice support for her ambitions. The drive home was tense and quiet. Finally, David broke the silence. "Maybe we should slow down a bit," he said carefully. "The partnership is a huge opportunity, and I don't want to jeopardize it by moving too fast on the consulting arrangements." Sandra felt something cold settle in her chest. "You're having second thoughts about working with me." "I'm not having second thoughts about us," David said quickly. "But maybe my parents have a point about taking things gradually. You could finish your program, get some experience with smaller projects, build up your credentials." "So I should wait until I'm deemed worthy enough to work with the Richardson firm?" Sandra's voice was deadly quiet. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it? Your parents raise concerns about my qualifications, and suddenly you want to slow down our professional collaboration. How long before those same concerns affect our personal relationship?" David pulled into her apartment complex parking lot and turned to face her. "Sandra, that's not fair. I love you. That hasn't changed." "Love isn't enough, David. Your mother made that clear from the beginning. She's systematically undermining my education and my career prospects, and now she's convincing you to distance yourself from our professional partnership. How long before she convinces you that I'm not good enough for marriage, either?" "You're being paranoid." The word hit Sandra like a physical blow. It was the same dismissive language Patricia used, reducing legitimate concerns to emotional overreaction. "Am I? Tell me honestly, if your parents asked you to choose between the partnership and our engagement, what would you choose?" David's hesitation was answer enough. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sandra was already getting out of the car. "Sandra, wait. I need some time to think."
she said without turning around. About everything. Over the next week, Sandra threw herself into her studies with desperate intensity, but the joy had gone out of her learning. Every assignment felt like a test she might fail. Every classroom discussion reminded her of Professor Hartwell's public humiliation. She found herself second-guessing every comment, wondering if her contributions sounded naive or uninformed. The breaking point came during a site visit to a mixed-use development in Santa Monica. The class was touring the project to analyze its environmental features and community integration strategies. Sandra had prepared extensively, reading the environmental impact reports and researching the neighborhood's demographic changes. But when she raised a question about the project's impact on affordable housing in the area, Professor Hartwell cut her off with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Martinez, we're here to study sustainable design features, not to rehash community advocacy talking points. Perhaps you could focus on the technical aspects of the project rather than the social justice implications." Several classmates shifted uncomfortably. The rebuke was not only harsh, but unfair. Community impact was explicitly part of the curriculum. Sandra felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. After the class, her study partner, Jessica Chen, approached her. "That was completely out of line," Jessica said quietly. "Your question was totally valid. Hartwell's been acting weird toward you all semester." "Someone's been poisoning the well," Sandra replied bitterly. "You mean the Richardson family?" When Sandra looked surprised, Jessica shrugged. "It's not hard to figure out. You're engaged to David Richardson, his family has major influence in development circles, and suddenly professors who used to praise your work are treating you like you're incompetent. It's pretty obvious." The validation felt good, but it also highlighted how hopeless Sandra's situation had become. If her classmates could see the pattern, it meant the sabotage was working. Her reputation was being damaged in ways that might follow her throughout her career. That evening, Sandra sat in the community garden as the sun set over Los Angeles, watching Mrs. Chen tend her vegetables with the same patient care she had shown for 3 years. The older woman noticed Sandra's troubled expression and settled beside her on the wooden bench Sandra had built during her first month managing the garden. "You look like someone who's fighting a war on too many fronts," Mrs. Chen observed. Sandra laughed bitterly. "That's exactly what it feels like. Every time I take a step forward, someone pushes me 3 steps back." "Mija, let me tell you about my grandmother," Mrs. Chen said, her weathered hands folding peacefully in her lap. "She came to this country with nothing. No money, no English, no education. People told her she didn't belong, that she should go back where she came from. You know what she did?" Sandra shook her head. "She opened a restaurant in Chinatown and made the best dumplings in Los Angeles. When people said her food was too foreign, too strange, she just kept cooking. When landlords tried to force her out, she found new locations. When competitors tried to undercut her prices, she focused on quality. She never got angry, never fought back directly. She just kept being excellent until excellence was undeniable." Mrs. Chen patted Sandra's hand gently. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed." As Sandra walked home that night, Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind. She was fighting Patricia Richardson's sabotage the wrong way, defensively, reactively, trying to prove she belonged in a system designed to exclude her. But what if she changed the game entirely? For the first time in weeks, Sandra smiled. She had an idea that would either launch her career or destroy it completely. But at this point, she had nothing left to lose. The war was about to shift to new territory, and Sandra was finally ready to stop playing by Patricia Richardson's rules.
Sandra's new strategy crystallized over the weekend as she researched something she'd never considered before, starting her own consulting firm. Not to compete with the Richardson empire, but to fill a gap she'd identified during her studies. A firm that specialized in community-centered sustainable development, bridging the world she knew better than anyone. Monday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Dr. Vasquez called with news that the city of Los Angeles was soliciting proposals for a pilot program to redesign underutilized public spaces in low-income neighborhoods. The project was small, only $75,000 in funding, but it would give the winning consultant a platform to demonstrate innovative approaches to community engagement and environmental design. "I immediately thought of you," Dr. Vasquez said during their coffee meeting at a cafe near campus. "Your background gives you exactly the perspective they're looking for. But Sandra, I need to warn you, this would mean going head-to-head with established firms who have resources you don't have." "Including Richardson and Associates?" Sandra asked. "Almost certainly. Frank Richardson has been on every major city contract for the past 20 years. Sandra felt a thrill of fear and excitement. "What would it take for me to submit a proposal?" "Technically, you'd need to register as a business entity and meet the city's consultant qualifications. But more practically, you'd need to develop a proposal that's so innovative and compelling that it overcomes your lack of track record." That afternoon, Sandra drove to the first site mentioned in the RFP, Hollenbeck Park in Boyle Heights, the same neighborhood where Marcus Williams had withdrawn her consulting opportunity. The park was a tired stretch of brown grass and broken playground equipment, surrounded by chain-link fencing and overlooked by aging apartment buildings and small businesses with signs in Spanish. But as Sandra walked the perimeter, she saw potential everywhere. The park was centrally located, accessible by bus and metro lines, and surrounded by a community that clearly needed green space. More importantly, she recognized the demographics from her community garden work. Working families, elderly residents, teenagers with few recreational options. She spent the next 3 hours talking to people in the neighborhood. Maria Santos, who ran a small grocery store across the street, complained about drug activity in the park after dark, but said her children had nowhere else to play. Carlos Mendoza, a mechanic whose shop bordered the park, mentioned that he'd love to see community events that brought people together safely. Mrs. Delgado, walking her elderly dog along the sidewalk, reminisced about when the park had hosted festivals and felt like the heart of the neighborhood. By evening, Sandra had filled a notebook with observations and ideas. This wasn't just about redesigning green space. It was about rebuilding community connections and creating economic opportunities for local residents. Over the next 2 weeks, Sandra worked on her proposal with an intensity that worried Maya. She spent her days at the community garden, but stayed up until 2 a.m. most nights, researching innovative urban design projects, creating detailed community engagement plans, and developing financial projections with help from online tutorials and her coursework. Her proposal was radical. Instead of hiring outside contractors, she wanted to train local residents in urban agriculture and green construction techniques, creating jobs while building the project. The design included community garden plots, a farmer's market pavilion, outdoor classroom space for environmental education, and a small business incubator focused on food and sustainability enterprises. "This is either brilliant or insane," Maya said, reviewing Sandra's draft proposal. "You're basically proposing to turn a park into a community development engine." "That's exactly what I'm proposing," Sandra replied, her eyes bright with exhaustion and determination. "Every other firm will submit standard landscape architecture plans. I'm offering something completely different, a model that could be replicated in underserved neighborhoods across the city." The proposal deadline was a Friday. Sandra submitted her bid electronically at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the cutoff. She'd registered her business as Raíces Urban Development, Roots in Spanish, reflecting her commitment to community-centered growth. That weekend, David finally called. They'd barely spoken since their argument about the partnership, communicating only through brief text messages. His voice was strained when she answered. "Sandra, we need to talk. Can I come over?" He arrived an hour later with flowers and a hesitant expression. Sandra's apartment showed signs of her intensive work. Architectural sketches taped to walls, city planning books stacked on every surface, her laptop surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers. "It looks like a war room in here," David said, trying to lighten the mood. "That's because I'm fighting a war," Sandra replied evenly. David sat on her couch, running his hair through his head. "I have been thinking about our last conversation, about what you said regarding my parents' influence. And I think you might be right. I've been noticing things, the way Mom asks about your classes, how Dad suddenly has concerns about working with unproven consultants. I don't think it's a coincidence." Sandra felt a flicker of hope. "So what are you going to do about it?" "I want to stand up to my parents. I want to tell them that I'm going to work with you regardless of their concerns." David reached for her hands. But Sandra, I need you to meet me halfway. This proposal you submitted, competing directly with my family's firm, it feels like you're trying to destroy everything we've built together. Sandra pulled her hands away. I'm trying to build something of my own, something that can't be taken away or undermined by your mother's phone calls. But why does it have to be adversarial? Why can't we find a way to work together within the existing system? Because the existing system is designed to keep people like me out. Sandra's voice rose with frustration. Your mother has made it clear that I will never be accepted as an equal in your world, so I'm creating my own world. David was quiet for a long moment. If you win this contract, it changes everything. My family will see it as a direct challenge, a declaration of war. Good, because that's exactly what it is. David left that night without resolving anything, and Sandra could see the gulf widening between them. He wanted her to succeed, but only within bounds that wouldn't threaten his family's comfort. She was tired of living within other people's boundaries.
The call came on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later. Sandra was teaching a group of teenagers how to plant winter vegetables when her phone rang with an unknown number. Ms. Martinez, this is Janet Kim from the City Planning Department. I'm calling about your Hollenbeck Park proposal. Sandra's heart hammered as she stepped away from the garden beds. Yes? I wanted to let you know personally that while your proposal was creative and well-researched, we've decided to go with Richardson and Associates for this project. They have the experience and resources to ensure successful completion. The words hit Sandra like a physical blow, but she managed to keep her voice steady. Can you tell me how the proposals were evaluated? The selection committee felt that while your community engagement approach was innovative, the project requires proven project management capabilities and established vendor relationships that only come with experience. After hanging up, Sandra sat on the bench in her garden and stared at the plants she'd nurtured from seeds. She'd poured everything into that proposal, her knowledge, her passion, her vision for what urban development could be, and it hadn't been enough. Mrs. Chen found her there an hour later, still staring at nothing. Bad news? The older woman asked gently. I didn't get the contract. They gave it to David's family firm instead. Mrs. Chen sat beside her. Did they tell you why? Experience, resources, the same reasons everyone uses to keep outsiders out. Mija, my grandmother's restaurant didn't succeed overnight. She failed many times before she found her path. But Sandra was past being comforted by stories of eventual triumph. Mrs. Chen, what if some battles can't be won? What if some systems are too rigged to change? That evening, Sandra called Dr. Vasquez to break the news. Her mentor's response surprised her. Sandra, I need to tell you something. I heard through unofficial channels that the selection was influenced by concerns about your firm's viability. Apparently, someone reached out to committee members questioning whether a brand new consultant could handle a city project. Sandra's blood ran cold. Patricia Richardson. I can't prove it, but the timing and language were very specific. Someone with influence and detailed knowledge of your background made sure that proposal was dead before it was even reviewed fairly. After hanging up, Sandra sat on the bench in her garden and stared at the plants she'd nurtured from seeds. She'd poured everything into that proposal, her knowledge, her passion, her vision for what urban development could be. And it hadn't been enough. The next blow came 2 days later. Professor Hartwell called Sandra into his office with news that made her stomach drop. Ms. Martinez, I'm concerned about your performance in this program. Your recent assignments have shown a concerning trend toward, well, unrealistic idealism that suggests you may not be grasping the practical constraints of professional urban planning. Sandra stared at him in disbelief. Her recent assignments had received strong grades from other professors, and her classmates regularly asked for her input on projects. Can you be more specific about these concerns? Your Hollenbeck Park proposal, for instance, while creative, it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of project feasibility and risk management. Several industry professionals have expressed concerns about the direction of your thinking. There it was again, the invisible network of industry professionals undermining her progress. Sandra realized with crystal clarity that Patricia Richardson was systematically destroying every path forward she tried to create. "Are you recommending I leave the program?" Sandra asked quietly. "I'm suggesting you consider whether this field is the right fit for your particular perspective and background." Walking across campus afterwards, Sandra felt something break inside her chest. She'd fought so hard, learned so much, sacrificed her relationship and her peace of mind, and it hadn't mattered. Patricia Richardson's influence was too pervasive, too entrenched. Every door Sandra tried to open was slammed shut before she could step through. That night, she called Maya. "I think I'm done," Sandra said, her voice hollow. "I can't win this fight. Every time I make progress, she destroys it. Maybe I should just accept that some worlds aren't meant for people like me." Maya was quiet for a long moment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to give David back his ring and find someone who comes from my world. Someone whose mother won't spend every day trying to destroy me." "Sandra, you don't mean that." But as Sandra hung up and stared at the engagement ring on her finger, she wondered if she did. Some fights were unwinnable, and some dreams were too expensive to pursue. Maybe it was time to stop fighting and start accepting reality. The next morning, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. She was going to end her engagement to David Richardson and walk away from his world forever. But first, she had one last conversation to have with the woman who had orchestrated her destruction. She was going to confront Patricia Richardson face to face, not to fight or argue, but to understand why destroying one young woman's dreams had been worth so much effort. And then she was going to disappear from their lives forever. It was time to surrender, but she was going to do it on her own terms.
Sandra spent Thursday night writing 2 letters. The first was to David, explaining why she was returning his ring and ending their engagement. She wrote and rewrote it 6 times, trying to find words that would convey her love for him while making clear that his world would never accept her as an equal. The second letter was her resignation from the UCLA program, a formal withdrawal that would end her academic pursuits and close the door on her urban planning dreams. But she couldn't bring herself to send either letter. Not yet. First, she needed to understand something that had been nagging at her for months. Why had Patricia Richardson worked so hard to destroy her? It went beyond simple disapproval or class prejudice. Patricia's campaign had been systematic, relentless, almost personal in its intensity. Friday morning, Sandra drove to the Richardson estate without calling ahead. The Mediterranean mansion looked even more imposing in daylight, its manicured gardens and sweeping driveways screaming privilege and exclusivity. Sandra parked her battered Honda next to Patricia's pristine white Mercedes and walked to the front door with the grim determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Patricia answered the door herself, dressed in cream-colored linen that probably cost more than Sandra's monthly rent. Her surprise was quickly masked by polite hostility. "Sandra, what an unexpected visit. David isn't here." "I'm not here to see David. I'm here to see you." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "How presumptuous. I'm quite busy today. Mrs. Richardson, I'm ending my engagement to your son. I'm withdrawing from school and leaving Los Angeles. You've won. But before I go, I need to understand why destroying me was so important to you." The directness seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She studied Sandra for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The interior of the house was as intimidating as Sandra remembered. Soaring ceilings, oil paintings, furniture that belonged in museums. Patricia led her to a sunroom overlooking the Pacific, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view that real estate agents would kill for. "Tea," Patricia offered, her tone returning to its usual polite iciness. "I won't be staying long." Patricia poured herself a cup from a silver service, her movements precise and controlled. "So you're giving up?" "I must say I'm surprised.
You seemed more persistent than that. I'm practical. You have resources I can't compete with, connections I'll never have, influence I'll never build. You can destroy any opportunity I create before I even know it exists. Yes, I can. Patricia's acknowledgement was matter-of-fact, almost conversational. But you're wrong about my motivations. This was never about you, specifically. Sandra felt confusion replace anger. What do you mean? Patricia settled into a cream-colored armchair, studying Sandra like a specimen under glass. 25 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. Young, idealistic, in love with a Richardson man. David's uncle, Michael, to be precise. The revelation hit Sandra like cold water. You weren't born into this family? Hardly. My father was a plumber in Riverside. My mother cleaned houses. Not unlike your own background, I believe. I was working as a secretary at Richardson and Associates when I met Michael. He was charming, progressive, full of ideas about changing the family business to be more socially conscious. Rather like David, actually. Sandra sat down slowly, her mind reeling. What happened? What always happens when idealism meets reality? Michael's father, David's grandfather, made it very clear that I was unsuitable. Too common, too unrefined, too likely to damage the family's reputation. Patricia's voice carried decades of buried pain. But unlike you, I didn't have the luxury of giving up and walking away. I was pregnant. Sandra's breath caught. With David? With a baby I miscarried at 6 months. Michael blamed the stress of his family's rejection. I blamed myself for not being strong enough, refined enough, worthy enough to protect my child. Patricia's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and wounded underneath. After the miscarriage, Michael ended our relationship, said it was better for both of us to face reality. But you stayed with the family. You married Frank. I transformed myself. Patricia's voice hardened again. I learned how to dress, how to speak, how to move in their world. I erased every trace of who I'd been and became exactly what they wanted in a Richardson wife. When Frank's first wife died in a car accident, I was ready, perfectly groomed, perfectly appropriate, perfectly acceptable. Sandra stared at Patricia, seeing her clearly for the first time. You became them to survive. I became them to win, and I've spent 25 years ensuring that the Richardson family maintains the standards that cost me so much to achieve. Her eyes were cold fire. Do you understand now? You represent everything I gave up, every authentic part of myself I sacrificed. Your very existence is a threat to the life I've built. The truth was devastating in its clarity. Patricia hadn't been protecting her son from Sandra. She'd been protecting herself from the reminder of who she used to be. So you destroyed my opportunities to validate your own choices? Sandra said quietly. I protected my family from repeating history. David thinks love conquers all because he's never had to choose between love and survival. You would have learned eventually that being yourself isn't enough in this world. I simply accelerated that education. Sandra felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, but a deep, resonating sadness for the woman Patricia had been and the woman she'd become. What if you're wrong? What if it's possible to be authentic and successful? What if I could have found a way? Patricia's laugh was bitter. My dear girl, I've watched a dozen women like us try to break into this world over the years. They all end up the same way, either transformed beyond recognition or discarded entirely. There is no third option. Maybe not for your generation, but things are changing. Nothing changes. Patricia's composure finally shattered, her voice rising with decades of suppressed pain. The same families control the same money and make the same decisions based on the same prejudices they've always had. You can get all the education you want, start all the companies you dream of, but they'll always find ways to keep you out because they can, because they have power, and power protects power.
In that moment, Sandra saw Patricia clearly, not as a villain, but as a casualty. A woman who'd been so thoroughly broken by the system that she'd become its enforcer, ensuring other women faced the same impossible choice she had. I'm sorry, Sandra said, and meant it. I'm sorry for what they did to you, for what you lost, for who you had to stop being. Patricia blinked, clearly not expecting compassion. I don't want your pity. It's not pity, it's recognition. You're right that this system is designed to break women like us. But Patricia, what if instead of enforcing it, we work together to change it? Change it? Patricia's voice was incredulous. You still don't understand, do you? You can't change a system that profits from your exclusion. You can only learn to work within it or be destroyed by it. Sandra stood up, something crystallizing in her mind with startling clarity. Maybe you're right. Maybe I can't change the system from the inside. But that doesn't mean I have to accept it. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm not going to become you, and I'm not going to let you turn me into you. Sandra's voice grew stronger with conviction. You chose to survive by erasing yourself. I'm going to choose differently. Patricia's eyes narrowed. You're going to choose poverty and obscurity over security and success? I'm going to choose authenticity over acceptance. I'm going to build something that doesn't require their approval or validation. And if they try to destroy it, I'll build it again and again until either I succeed or I die trying. That's naive ideology. Maybe, but it's my naive ideology. And I'd rather fail being myself than succeed being someone else. Sandra walked toward the door, then paused. There's one more thing you should know, Patricia. David loves you despite what you've become, not because of it. He sees glimpses of who you used to be, and that's what he's trying to protect in me. By destroying me, you're also destroying the part of yourself that he loves most. Patricia's face went white, but Sandra didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the mansion and back to her car, her hands shaking, but her mind clearer than it had been in months. As she drove away from the Richardson estate, Sandra made 3 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Vasquez. Elena, I'm not withdrawing from the program. I'm going to finish what I started, regardless of who tries to stop me. Sandra, what changed? I stopped trying to win their approval and started focusing on my own goals. The second call was to Maya. I need your help with something. How would you feel about being co-founder of an urban development consulting firm that specializes in community empowerment? Are you insane? Maya laughed. Absolutely. When do we start? The third call was the hardest. David answered on the second ring. Sandra, I've been trying to reach you all day. Mom said you came by the house? David, we need to talk, but not about your mother or your family or their expectations. We need to talk about what we want our future to look like, independent of anyone else's opinion. Okay, David said slowly. When and where? Tonight, the community garden, 7 o'clock. And David, come prepared to choose between the life your family wants for you and the life you actually want to live. After hanging up, Sandra drove to the Hullenbeck Park site where her proposal had been rejected. The park was still brown and broken, still surrounded by a community that deserved better. But now she saw it differently. Not as a project she'd failed to win, but as a reminder of why her work mattered. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching new ideas, not for a city contract or a client's approval, but for the community itself. What if she didn't need permission from the city or funding from established sources? What if she could organize the residents to transform their own space, one small project at a time? For the first time in months, Sandra smiled. Patricia Richardson had been wrong about one crucial thing. There was a third option. Sandra didn't have to transform herself to fit their world, and she didn't have to be destroyed by their rejection. She could create her own world instead. As the sun set over Los Angeles, Sandra sat in her car planning a revolution that would start with a single park and spread to every underserved community willing to fight for their own transformation. She might not have their money or connections, but she had something they'd never possess, the trust and respect of the communities they'd written off. David arrived at the community garden at exactly 7 o'clock, still wearing his work suit, but carrying 2 cups of coffee from their old favorite cafe.
Sandra was kneeling beside a bed of winter vegetables, her hands dirty and her face peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in months. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path. "Thank you for coming," she said, accepting the coffee and gesturing to the wooden bench they'd shared so many evenings during their courtship. "Sandra, about my mother." "David, stop." Sandra's voice was gentle but firm. "I need you to listen without defending anyone or explaining anything. Can you do that?" He nodded, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I went to see your mother today. She told me things about her past, about your family, about the choices she made to survive in your world." Sandra chose her words carefully. "I understand now why she's been fighting me so hard. But understanding doesn't change what I need to tell you." Sandra turned to face him fully. "I'm not going to try to fit into your family anymore. I'm not going to change myself to earn their approval or prove that I'm worthy of their acceptance. And I'm not going to ask you to choose between me and them." David's face went pale. "You're breaking up with me." "I'm giving you the choice your mother never got to make freely. I'm telling you exactly who I am and what I want, and you get to decide if that's the life you want too." Sandra pulled out her phone and showed him the sketches she'd made at Hollenbeck Park. "I'm going to finish my education, and then I'm going to build something completely different. Maya and I are starting a consulting firm that works directly with communities, bypassing the traditional development process entirely. We're going to help neighborhoods transform themselves from the ground up." David studied the sketches, his architect's eye immediately grasping her vision. "This is brilliant, Sandra. But how will you fund it? How will you get permits and approvals without working within the system?" "We'll start small, guerrilla gardening, pop-up markets, community workshops. We'll prove the concepts work before we worry about official approval. And when we do need to work with city agencies, they'll have results they can't ignore." "That could take years, decades." "Then it takes decades." Sandra's voice was steady with conviction. "David, I'd rather spend my life building something meaningful than my life trying to be accepted by people who've already decided I don't belong." David was quiet for a long time, staring at her sketches. "What about us? What about our future?" "That depends on what future you want. If you want to be a Richardson first and David second, if you want the partnership and the family approval and the traditional path, then I understand. I won't fight for you anymore because I can't compete with that kind of security." Sandra reached into her pocket and pulled out the engagement ring, holding it between them like a question. "But if you want to build something new, something that honors both of our values, then I want you to choose that consciously. Not because you're swept up in romance or rebellion, but because you've honestly evaluated the cost and decided it's worth paying." David stared at the ring, his internal struggle written across his face. "My family will disown me." "They might. Your mother did warn me that there are only two options in your world: transform or be discarded. She learned that the hard way. And you're choosing to be discarded? I'm choosing to create a third option. The question is whether you want to create it with me." David took the ring from her palm, turning it over in his hands. The vintage setting caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the fruit trees Sandra had planted along the garden's border. "If I choose you, choose this path, there's no going back. The firm, the family expectations, the financial security, all of it disappears." "Yes." "And you're okay with that? With me giving up everything I've worked for?" Sandra smiled sadly. "David, you're not giving up everything you've worked for. You're giving up everything your family has worked for. The question is, what do you want to work for?" That question hung between them as the sun set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold that reminded Sandra of the evening David had proposed. But everything had changed since then. Her understanding of his world, her vision for her own future, her willingness to compromise her authentic self for anyone else's comfort.
David stood up and walked to the edge of the garden, looking out over the neighborhood where Sandra had spent 3 years proving that transformation was possible when communities controlled their own destiny. When he turned back, his expression had shifted to something Sandra had never seen before: complete certainty. "I want to work for this," he said, gesturing to the garden around them, "for communities that get to determine their own futures, for development that serves people instead of profit margins, for a world where someone like my mother doesn't have to erase herself to survive." He walked back to Sandra and knelt in front of the bench where she sat. "Sandra Martinez, will you marry me? Not because our families approve or because it makes financial sense, but because I want to spend my life building beautiful things with you." This time, Sandra's tears were joyful as she said yes and let him slip the ring back onto her finger. But even as they kissed, she knew the real work was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Southern California weather that made everything seem possible. They'd chosen to marry in the community garden where they'd reconnected, surrounded by the vegetables and fruit trees that represented growth, patience, and the beauty that emerged when people tended to things with love. The guest list was small and intentionally diverse. Sandra's mother, who'd driven down from Bakersfield with tears of pride in her eyes. Maya, resplendent in maid of honor in a dress the color of sunflowers. Dr. Vasquez and several classmates from the UCLA program. Residents from the Riverside community garden, and a handful of David's college friends who'd always seen him more clearly than his family had. Frank Richardson sat in the front row, having quietly attended despite Patricia's absence. He'd reached out to David 2 weeks earlier, explaining that while he couldn't openly defy his wife, he couldn't miss his son's wedding. The conversation was awkward, but honest, and David had accepted his father's limitations while appreciating his presence. As Sandra walked down the aisle between beds of flowering vegetables, wearing her grandmother's pearl earrings and a simple white dress she'd found at a vintage shop, she felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her during the engagement party. This celebration belonged to her and David, reflecting their values rather than other people's expectations. The ceremony was officiated by Maya, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. She spoke about love that encourages growth rather than demanding conformity, about partnerships that make both people stronger rather than requiring one person to diminish themselves. Sandra and David, you're choosing to build a life together that honors both of your authentic selves. That's radical in a world that often demands we choose between love and integrity. May your marriage be proof that we don't have to make that choice.
David's vows made Sandra cry. "I promise to love you not just as you are today, but as you continue to become. I promise to build with you, not just structures and businesses, but communities and possibilities. And I promise that our partnership will always be about addition, not subtraction, making each other more ourselves, not less." Sandra's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to trust your choices even when they're difficult. I promise to build dreams with you that serve something bigger than ourselves. And I promise that I will never ask you to be anyone other than exactly who you are, because that person is who I fell in love with." After the ceremony, guests gathered under string lights Maya had hung between the fruit trees for a reception that featured food from the neighborhood's best small restaurants and music from a mariachi band recommended by Mrs. Chen. The cake was lemon lavender, made by Sandra's mother using herbs from the garden itself. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sandra and David found themselves alone in the garden where their love story had taken so many turns. They sat on their old bench, Sandra's head on David's shoulder, watching the last of the sunset paint the sky. "Any regrets?" Sandra asked quietly. "About marrying you? Never. About the path we're choosing? Ask me in 10 years when we're either revolutionizing urban development or living in a cardboard box." Sandra laughed. "We could do both. Revolutionary cardboard box architecture could be our specialty." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside the garden gates. To their surprise,
Patricia Richardson emerged from her white Mercedes, walking carefully across the gravel in heels that were entirely inappropriate for a community garden. She stopped a few feet away from their bench, her expression unreadable in the dim light. For a long moment, no one spoke. "I came to give you this," Patricia finally said, extending a small wrapped package toward Sandra. Sandra accepted the gift with cautious curiosity. Inside was a small silver locket, tarnished with age and obviously well-loved. "It belonged to my grandmother," Patricia said quietly. "The only thing I kept from my old life. She used to tell me that being poor didn't mean being powerless, that dignity came from how you treated people, not how much money you had." Sandra opened the locket to find a tiny photo of a young woman with Patricia's eyes but Sandra's expression, hopeful, determined, uncompromising. "I thought you should have it," Patricia continued. "Since you're choosing the path I couldn't." The three of them stood in the gathering darkness, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. Finally, Patricia turned to leave, then paused. "David, you know this means you're no longer welcome in the family business." "I know, Mom. And that your trust fund is contingent on maintaining family standards." "I know." Patricia nodded once, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "Then I suppose you've both made your choices." She walked back to her car, leaving Sandra holding the locket and David holding her hand. As Patricia's taillights disappeared down the street, Sandra felt a strange sense of completion. Not victory, this hadn't been about winning or losing, but resolution. "She gave me her grandmother's locket," Sandra said wonderingly. "She gave you permission," David replied, "to succeed where she couldn't." 1 year later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Hollenbeck Park Community Development Project drew a crowd that spilled far beyond the park's newly expanded boundaries. Sandra stood with a pair of oversized scissors, flanked by Maya, David, and Maria Santos, whose grocery store had become the anchor for the park's new farmers market pavilion. The transformation had taken 18 months of community organizing, fundraising, and guerrilla implementation, but the results were undeniable. Where there had once been brown grass and broken equipment, there were now vegetable gardens tended by local families, a covered pavilion hosting weekly markets for neighborhood entrepreneurs, outdoor classroom space where Sandra taught environmental workshops, and a playground built by residents using sustainable materials. More importantly, crime in the area had dropped by 40%, local businesses were thriving, and the park had become a model for community-controlled development that was being studied by urban planners across the country. This project proves that communities don't need to wait for outside developers to transform their neighborhoods. When people control their own destiny, when they're supported rather than displaced, incredible things happen. After the ceremony, Sandra was approached by Councilwoman Rosa Delgado, who represented the district encompassing Hollenbeck Park. "Miss Martinez, I've been watching your work here with great interest. The city is preparing to allocate $15 million for community development projects in underserved neighborhoods. Would Riverside Urban Development be interested in bidding on a much larger contract?" Sandra smiled, thinking how different this moment felt from her first failed proposal. "We'd be honored to submit a proposal. But I should warn you, we do things differently. Our first commitment is always to the community, not the bottom line." "That's exactly why we want to work with you." Later that evening, Sandra and David celebrated at their favorite taco truck, parked on a folding table in their small apartment that had become the unofficial headquarters of Riverside Urban Development. The walls were covered with architectural sketches, community engagement plans, and photos from their various projects across Los Angeles. 10 more proposals came in today, Maya announced, bursting through the door with a laptop bag and an expression of controlled panic. "We're going to need to hire actual employees soon." "Good problems to have," David said, looking up from the financial projections spread across their kitchen table. "Though we should probably also get an actual office soon." Sandra leaned back in her chair, surveying the organized chaos of their life together. It wasn't the future either of them had originally planned. David working for a community development firm instead of a prestigious architecture company, Sandra building her reputation one small project at a time instead of climbing traditional career ladders.
both of them living on ramen noodles and determination instead of trust funds and family connections. But it was theirs, built from their own values, serving their own vision, accountable to communities rather than shareholders. When Sandra looked at David, focused intently on budget calculations for their next project, she saw someone who'd chosen authenticity over security and never looked back. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Vasquez. Saw the news coverage of Hollenbeck? Proud of you. Your final project proposal just got accepted for presentation at the National Urban Planning Conference. You're going to change how this field thinks about community engagement. Sandra smiled, remembering the scared young woman who'd sat in Dr. Vasquez's office 18 months ago, wondering if she was smart enough to survive in an academic program designed for people with different backgrounds and advantages. That woman couldn't have imagined this moment. Professional recognition, meaningful work, a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. As she looked around their small apartment filled with big dreams and concrete plans to achieve them, Sandra realized Patricia Richardson had been both wrong and right. The system was designed to exclude people like them, to force impossible choices between authenticity and success. But Patricia had been wrong about the alternatives. Sandra hadn't had to transform herself to fit their world or accept destruction as the price of resistance. She had created a third option, building her own world with its own standards of success and its own definition of worth. And in that world, a girl from Riverside with dirt under her fingernails and love in her heart was more than good enough. She was exactly what the world needed. Outside their window, Los Angeles sprawled in all directions, full of communities waiting to transform themselves if given the chance. Sandra Martinez Richardson had work to do, and for the first time in her life, she had the tools, the support, and the unshakable confidence to do it. The war Patricia had started was over. Sandra had won by refusing to fight on anyone else's terms but her own.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.